For the Lebanese population, the Israeli incursion is yet another nightmare, exacerbating years of crisis. Hundreds of thousands of people reported to have fled the country since the start of the conflict with Israel. Lebanon already brought to its knees by the financial crisis back in 2019, which followed years of successive governments piling up debts from all the way back to the civil war, from the mid-70s to 1990, Gulf states withdrawing support after Iran's influence increasing. Then deep into the economic crisis, the Beirut port explosion 2020, killing nearly 300 people, leaving more than 250,000 homeless, blaming that explosion on government corruption, mismanagement. So a long way from the days, remember, Beirut regarded of the Paris of the East, when money rolled in, tourism was booming. This is from British Pathé back in the late 60s.
The financial comparison of the Lebanon to Switzerland and its role as the trading house of the Middle East is a fair one. Free enterprise flourishes. Modern roads cover the country. Luxury buildings and hotels have sprung up. One of the main objects of both is tourism.
So British Pathé back in 1969. The question is, to what extent is Lebanon risking becoming a failed state? Is it to an extent? How does the government function as well right now? And also, what's become of the army? And who does Israel deal with ultimately when it comes to peace, the withdrawal after the incursion, when and if that time comes? Maybe some of those questions we can get an answer to. Sami Atallah, the co-founder of the Policy Initiative think tank in Beirut. Really good to have you on the programme, Sami, to set out some of the context, some of the answers here. And let's start with my last question, try to work from there and understand the deep morass in the state of Lebanon. Who do you think Israel does deal with when it comes to any peace talks and leaving the territory, rebuilding on the Lebanese side?
Well, first of all, we need to see what the outcome of the battlefield, because that's what's going to actually matter the most. But let me just say first, based on your reporting, we have forgotten to say that Israel has violated Lebanon's airspace 22,000 times between 2007 and 2022. So while Israel and Bibi Netanyahu is complaining about the UN for not imposing or implementing Resolution 1701, he has forgotten to say how many times Israel actually violated Lebanese sovereignty over the last 15 years. Not only that, because Israel has refused to abide by any UN international resolutions or ceasefire on Gaza. So we can see Israel is acting as actually a rogue state, in fact, in the last few years. Now, concerning your question concerning Lebanon and concerning the role of the army, well, in fact, it depends on the battlefield, but the army has to have a role to play the day after. Definitely, and it will, as it did in 2006, it will assume the key positions.
Well, let's take it
Hello?
piece by piece, Sami. I can still hear you loud and clear, if you can still see and hear me. Let's talk about the condition, the state of the Lebanese army. How is it functioning at the moment? What's it doing?
Gavin, sorry, I lost you. I lost the network. Can you repeat the question?
Of course, I'm back with you, Sami. I can hear you. If you can hear me, give me a thumbs up. You can hear me. You can see me.
I can hear you. Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. Let's talk about the Lebanese army. Talk us through what it's doing, how it's functioning. I understand they're helping out with effectively refugees right now. Talk to me about the state of it.
Sure. The Lebanese army is underfunded. It has never played a role to protect Lebanese borders, unfortunately. The Lebanese regime or political establishment did not invest in building an army that can actually protect the boundaries and the borders of Lebanon from Israeli incursion. Neither regional or international powers ever helped the Lebanese army to defend itself. The Lebanese army's role in Lebanon is to ensure domestic stability, quote unquote, and it should have played a more of an effective role, particularly in mobilizing and helping people run away from the south because of the Israeli rampage. And unfortunately, it did not do an effective job in that. So now we're expecting the army to play a role once the dust settles to actually assume its positions and maintain whatever ceasefire comes about. But that, again, depends on the battlefield.
Here's the rub at the moment, Sami, and maybe you can take us a bit further into this one. You have Western leaders talking about a possible conference to try to rehabilitate the Lebanese army so that they have a functioning role at some point in future in the south. Those talks continuing, not confirmed at the moment. And yet, whisper it, a number of Gulf states that are hoping perhaps that the Lebanese army doesn't come back to its strongest previous self. Just talk us through those geopolitical issues.
Yeah, I don't think they actually have the strongest intention of helping Lebanon to build its army. And we saw this when Syria withdrew from Lebanon in 2005, and the Western power became more interested in actually rebuilding the Lebanese army. But they saw the Lebanese army's role to ensure domestic stability. And then after the refugee crisis in Syria, where we have 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon, is to make the peace and make sure they don't actually go to Europe, these refugees, and hence protect Europe. So in fact, the interest of Western power vis-a-vis the Lebanese army is to make sure Lebanon doesn't blow up or Lebanon doesn't implode, in order to, in fact, to make sure that the problem is not exported to Europe. That's as much as they care about the Lebanese army, and that's very unfortunate because we're hoping to have a stronger army that can play a more effective role in protecting the borders, in protecting us from the Israeli incursions, protecting us from Israeli violation of the sovereignty of Lebanon. And because we don't have that, you end up having groups like Hezbollah, and before it, the PLO, and before it, using Lebanon territory, to challenge Israel's hegemony and to protect the Lebanese population in the south, particularly, who have been in the 60s and the 70s victims of Israeli violations and firepower.
I've been back and forth over the years to Lebanon a number of times, to Beirut, to Byblos, to Tripoli in the north. And when I speak to contacts and friends there, various times people will say to me, it feels like Lebanon is a failed state, and given what's happening at the moment, it's very hard to see how they can stay in the country. I've had WhatsApp messages from colleagues, from friends who are saying they're leaving, they're taking their children, there's no education. Tell me the extent that you believe Lebanon risks being a failed state and how it gets potentially, how it moves from here.
Absolutely. Indeed, Lebanon has been facing a poly crisis, and you've already mentioned them in terms of the financial implosion, the port explosion, the corona, even the earthquake at one point, and now the war, which has had catastrophic effect on the country, with 1.2 million people displaced, 10,000 injured, 2,000 dead. And people are actually feeling really, really desperate in the sense that they cannot endure any more of that pain and conflict and war and misery, in fact. And the responsibility, in fact, of this has been at the several layers, and including from the government and the political establishment collectively, and all assumed power in the last 30 years, and particularly in the last 5 years, who failed to undertake reforms, who failed, in fact, not even failed, who stopped and blocked the reforms, the socio-economic reforms for the country to be back on its feet. So I think there's a collective responsibility on all those who assumed power, all the political parties that assumed power or did not hold others accountable and hijacked the political institutions in the country. And I think this blame goes across all those who actually were in power or of responsibility. So we know what the solution is.
I'm going to bring... No, Sami, I'm still with you. We can still hear you loud and clear. I'm going to bring Iris back in a moment. I would like to get your thought on this, though. If we see a scenario now for Lebanon, you've described it very well, but if there's some light, possibly some chink of hope, if you look at Hezbollah, regarded as a terrorist organisation in much of the Western world, it's called the state within a state. Will we see, is there a possibility, given the actions, the escalate to de-escalate mentality of Israel, that it unwraps and loosens itself from the state, the government take a bigger role? Where do you stand on that?
Okay, there are 2 points to this. First of all, the way the West actually conceives Hezbollah versus how it sees the Israeli army, in fact, which is a terrorist army. Let's remember that Bibi Netanyahu is a war criminal, has committed genocide. So if you want to talk about terrorism, I think the West should really revise this definition and include Israel for actually what it has done to Gaza. So let's not go and just package this and blame Hezbollah as a terrorist organization and forgive Israel, and even thinking that Israel is doing Lebanon a favor. It's not, because Israeli army and Israeli government and even Israeli society has actually been encouraging and supporting the genocide taking place in Gaza and in the war in Lebanon. So clearly, let's put things in perspective. The second point I want to say, people who say that, or the argument you're making, they're assuming as if Hezbollah is blocking the reforms or the only party blocking the reforms. I disagree with that. I think Hezbollah did block the reform, yes, but all the parties that are against Hezbollah equally blocked the reforms for Lebanon. So to assume and to think that once you get rid of Hezbollah, and assuming you could do that, Lebanon will resume its role as the Paris of the Middle East, is actually very wrong, because the political parties that are against Hezbollah are equally bad in actually reforming the country, reforming the institutions, and in fact put Lebanon on the right track for recovery on both economic and social matters.
Sami Atallah, good to talk to you. Certainly you'll never be accused of not showing your opinions on these matters. We'll talk to you soon, no doubt, at the Polity Initiative, the co-founder in Beirut. Let's bring Iris back in. Just listening to Sami, Iris, Sami's viewpoint isn't alone. A lot of my Lebanese contacts, a lot of friends, so frustrated, so terrified being in Beirut. As much as they blame Hezbollah, they blame the Israeli military. And that comes back to what we've spoken about before, doesn't it? That risk of losing, well, hearts and minds for those that they still had.
That's right. You know, if you're in Beirut and you're at the receiving end of Israeli firepower, then you blame Israel for that. I mean, you might take a bigger view and say, Hezbollah shouldn't have attacked Israel first, but that's lost in the mists of time, and you are running from Israeli bombs right now. So yes, I can see that it's a very vexed issue if you're inside Beirut or inside the south of Lebanon, or indeed leaving your homes in the south of Lebanon. I do have to say there are also displaced Israelis in the north of Israel. So, you know, it's the civilians on both sides, the north of Israel, the south of Lebanon, where the war is currently being fought. Tens of thousands on both sides, hundreds of thousands in Lebanon, tens of thousands in Israel, who are no longer in their homes.
Right, another issue to put to you, Iris, because as we're talking, we are 12 days today since the Iranian strikes on Israel, almost 200 ballistic missiles, and that comes 12 days after the death of Hassan Nasrallah that Iran waited 2 strikes. Now, there's reports today, Iris, of back-channel communications between Tehran and Tel Aviv. I don't know if that is true or not. Iran effectively testing the waters of what may come in terms of a response. Before I get your thought on that, let's hear today from a number of Iranian ministers on how they are preparing for the counter-strike.
The Islamic Republic of Iran does not want escalated tensions and war, although it is ready for any situation. We are ready for war and ready for peace as well.
The continuity of the war and its expansion towards the Islamic Republic of Iran and the use of Iraqi airspace for that is not accepted and firmly rejected. We are trying to prevent the war, but if it happened, God forbid, then Iraq and its airspace must be kept out of the war atmosphere.
So there's a meeting in Iraq today between the 2 foreign ministers of Iran and Iraq, and as we're on air, the US, this is from AP press agency, saying that they will send Terminal High Altitude Area Defence Battery to support Israel. Iris, talk us through what's going on in terms of reports of delays and what we could see, possibly, information you're getting on a possible counterstrike.
There's lots of speculation, and I have to say that as someone who was waiting for the Lebanese counterstrike, in fact, the Hezbollah counterstrike in the month of July, the simple waiting is part of the process, as Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah said in his speech, actually, at that time. 40 days later, with everybody waiting, the tension just ratchets up. So I can imagine that they're very tense in in Iran at the moment, and you can see that from the fact that the head of the Quds forces, that is part of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, has been missing for over a week, with some saying that he's in Beirut lost, some saying that he's being questioned in Iran. There's definitely tension in Iran as they wait for the Israeli counterstrike. What form will it take? It's not clear. I have heard, people here arguing that if you're going to hit Iran's nuclear sites, now is the time. That's a very complicated thing that Israel can't do on its own. It needs American support for that, perhaps wider than just America. It would need a coalition in order to do that, both physically and then in the response to it. That announcement tonight of an US putting its missile shield, if you like. Israel's missile shield is not as effective against these ballistic missiles. The US is providing its missile shield, and that means also it doesn't give it to Israel to operate. That means American soldiers will be operating it. So that announcement just coming through. Does that mean that they're anticipating or have been told of a larger Israeli strike? Or, as I heard one Iranian expert born in Iran, now living in Israel, suggesting that the best thing to do would actually be to hit the Iranian Revolutionary Guard leaders. They are the enforcers for the regime. It would be a definite blow against the regime, the current government. So all these things are being discussed all the time, but the truth is no one knows, and no one knows a time either. And I cannot imagine that if the US is consulted, it would agree to the widest possible response right now when November the 5th, the American election, is so close.
Iris, great to talk to you. As always, Iris Makler, our correspondent in Jerusalem.